The water is warm. That is the first and most overwhelming physical reality of the world 419 million years ago. It is a profound, uninterrupted warmth that reaches from the sunlit surface down into the deep coastal margins. There are no cold currents upwelling from polar ice caps because the ice caps do not exist. The entire planet is held in a vast, global embrace of thermal energy. Sunlight strikes the surface of the global ocean, an immense body of water that covers roughly 85% of the Earth, and that light is absorbed and held. The heat penetrates deeply, creating an environment that feels less like an ocean and more like an endless, planetary-scale incubator. This is the beginning of the Devonian period. It does not announce itself with sudden catastrophes or dramatic celestial events. It begins with the slow, patient accumulation of heat and dissolved minerals in a world that is preparing to rewrite the fundamental rules of biology. Above the surface, the atmosphere is heavy. It presses down on the water with a physical weight that would feel heavy. The air is thick with carbon dioxide, holding concentrations many times higher than anything the modern Earth experiences. This dense greenhouse blanket traps the thermal radiation of the sun, reflecting it back toward the surface and preventing the heat of the day from escaping into the void of space. The sky carries a hazy, humid quality, heavy with moisture drawn up from the endless warm seas. Rain falls constantly in massive sheets over the open water, returning fresh water to the saline depths in a ceaseless cycle. The wind moves freely, gathering unimaginable momentum over thousands of miles of unbroken ocean, whipping the surface into long, rolling swells that travel for weeks before finally crashing against the raw red rock of the ancient continents. To sink beneath the waves is to enter a realm of profound and absolute silence. There are no songs of whales echoing across the continental shelves. There are no clicks of dolphins hunting in the dark. The acoustic landscape of the early Devonian ocean is entirely physical. It is the low, sustained roar of the surface turbulence, the rhythmic grinding of sand and crushed shell rolling along the seafloor, and the deep, low-frequency groans of tectonic plates shifting miles beneath the crust. Into this vast acoustic emptiness, the light filters down. It bends and fractures through the warm upper layers, casting a constantly shifting lattice of gold and pale green across the shallow bottom. In these sunlit zones, the water is saturated with dissolved calcium, iron, and silica. Every molecule necessary to build bone, shell, and biological architecture is suspended in the warm current. The geography that holds this immense ocean shares no resemblance to familiar maps. The long, recognizable curves of the modern continents are completely absent. Instead, an enormous supercontinent known as Gondwana stretches across the southern hemisphere, its northern margins reaching the tropical equator, while its southern interior extends into the polar latitudes. Even at the pole, the greenhouse climate prevents the formation of permanent glaciers. The land remains bare, rocky, and baked by the sun. North of Gondwana lies another massive landmass, Laurussia, sitting directly across the equator. Between these giant fragments of continental crust lies the Rake Ocean, a wide, shallow, tropical sea that functions as the primary engine of marine evolution. It is along the flooded margins of Laurussia, in water just tens of meters deep, that the most critical biological developments are slowly taking shape. The planet spins faster on its axis during this era. A single day lasts only 22 hours, accelerating the cycle of light and dark. The Moon, sitting significantly closer to the Earth than it does in modern times, exerts a massive gravitational pull. This proximity creates tides of staggering power and scale. Twice every 22 hours, the ocean rises and falls with a power that sweeps the continental shelves. Millions of tons of water drag across the shallow sea floor, pulling nutrients from the rock and distributing them out into the open water. This relentless lunar rhythm acts as a giant circulatory system, ensuring that the shallow, sunlit nurseries are constantly flushed with fresh minerals. The friction of these massive tides slowly acts as a brake on the rotation of the Earth, a process that will eventually lengthen the day over hundreds of millions of years. Life in this ocean is abundant, but it operates on a different set of mechanical principles. Along the warm, sandy bottom, trilobites move with deliberate, mechanical precision. They are armored, multi-segmented arthropods, blind or equipped with complex compound eyes made of crystal calcite. They scour the microbial mats that cover the seafloor, processing organic detritus with slow, rhythmic movements of their many legs. Above them, in the water column, the earliest fish swim. They are small, heavily armored, and entirely jawless. They navigate the currents using muscular tails, their bodies encased in rigid plates of bone that limit their flexibility. They survive by filtering microscopic organisms from the water or sucking soft organic matter from the mud. They cannot bite. They cannot grasp. Their interaction with the world is fundamentally passive, yet these jawless fish carry within them a profound biological legacy. The water that sustains them is the same water that will eventually circulate through the bodies of every terrestrial animal. The dissolved calcium they use to build their external armor is the exact element that will one day construct the internal skeletons of mammals, birds, and humans. The Devonian Ocean is the original reservoir of biological raw materials. The chemical processes happening right now, in the warm shallows of the Reich Ocean, are establishing the fundamental building blocks of complex life. The rigid structure of human bone is a distant echo of the calcium carbonate, slowly precipitating out of this ancient, heavy sea. There is a sense of impending transformation in the warm currents. The passive, jawless existence is reaching its structural limits. The shallow continental shelves, constantly bathed in sunlight and flushed with nutrients by the massive lunar tides, are becoming crowded. Competition for space and resources along the seafloor is intensifying. In the slow, blind calculus of evolution, pressure is building. The external armor of the jawless fish is becoming heavier, an arms race of defense against an unseen threat. The Devonian is preparing to invent a mechanism that will change the trajectory of life forever, shifting the ocean from a realm of passive filter feeders to an arena of active predators. The sun arcs across the hazy sky, completing its accelerated journey. The massive tides pull the water back and forth. The deep planetary silence of the early Devonian is not the silence of an empty world. It is the deep breath taken before a colossal explosion of biological creativity. To comprehend the Devonian world, one must abandon every familiar map. If an observer were to hang in the silent vacuum of orbit, looking down upon the Earth 419 million years ago, they would struggle to find a single recognizable coastline. There is no North America, no curved horn of Africa, no fragmented archipelago of Southeast Asia. The surface of the planet is a canvas dominated almost entirely by the deep, absorbing blue of the Panthalassic Ocean. Against this overwhelming expanse of water, the landmasses sit in strange, unbalanced configurations. They are not green. From space, the continents appear as vast, jagged stains of deep rust and ochre, stark and naked against the global sea. It is a world cleanly divided between the fluid energy of the water and the barren silence of the stone. The largest of these terrestrial islands is Gondwana. It is an amalgamation of land that will one day fracture into South America, Africa, Antarctica, and Australia. In this era, it is fused into a single, continuous mass. Its northern shorelines bask in the warm waters of the tropical equator, while its southern reaches curve far down toward the pole. But even in those extreme southern latitudes, the heavy greenhouse atmosphere prevents the formation of a permanent ice cap. The interior of Gondwana is a place of absolute desolation. Removed from the moderating influence of the ocean, the deep inland regions are subjected to brutal temperature fluctuations. It is a landscape of cracked bedrock, sweeping dunes of mineral dust, and endless, howling winds. Nothing grows here, nothing moves, save for the shadow of the sun passing over miles of empty rock. North of this southern giant, sitting squarely across the equator, lies Laurussia. It is here that the geological power of the planet is most visible. Along the eastern edge of this landmass, tectonic plates are locked in a slow, crushing collision. A smaller fragment of crust is driving itself into the main continent, forcing the bedrock to buckle and thrust upward. This is the Akkadian orogeny. It is raising a mountain range that rivals the modern Himalayas in sheer vertical scale. These peaks are jagged, raw, and newly born. They pierce the heavy, humid atmosphere, forcing the wet ocean air upward, where it cools and releases its moisture in perpetual storms. Because there is no vegetation to anchor the landscape, no networks of roots to hold the earth together, the water falls upon the mountains with immense mechanical force. It shatters the exposed rock. It dissolves the iron and silicate minerals. Gravity pulls this water downward, carving deep, temporary channels into the flanks of the mountains. These are not rivers as the modern world understands them. They are chaotic, unpredictable floods of heavy, red mud. Millions of tons of oxidized iron sediment are stripped from the high altitudes and carried across the lowlands, burying the coastal plains under thick, rust-colored layers. This relentless erosion is laying down a geological signature that will last for hundreds of millions of years. An immense deposit of rock known as the Old Red Sandstone. The continent is bleeding its physical substance directly into the sea. Above this stark landscape, the sky operates on an accelerated rhythm. The Earth of the early Devonian completes a full rotation on its axis in only 22 hours. The sun moves across the hazy, moisture-laden sky with a noticeable urgency. The shadows cast by the jagged Akkadian peaks stretch and shrink faster than they should. Twilight is brief. When the sun dips below the horizon, the darkness that falls over the barren red continents is absolute, unbroken by any artificial light. But the night sky is not empty. It blazes with the unhindered light of the Milky Way, and dominating this celestial canopy is a moon that appears immensely large. 419 million years ago, the moon orbits significantly closer to the Earth. It hangs in the Devonian night like a massive, pale lantern, its cratered surface deeply detailed and brilliant against the dark. The sheer visual weight of it is staggering. The proximity of the moon is not merely a visual spectacle, it is a profound physical force. The gravitational pull exerted by this close satellite is immense, and it drags upon the global ocean with a power that the modern world has long since forgotten. The tides of the Devonian are colossal. Because the continental shelves surrounding Laurussia and Gondwana are extremely shallow and slope outward for hundreds of miles, the rising water does not simply lap against a beach. It advances as a relentless, horizontal flood. Twice every 22 hours, a wall of water sweeps inward across the exposed red mudflats. The sound of the incoming tide is a low, sustained roar that vibrates through the bedrock. It is the sound of millions of gallons of heavy, saline water dragging across sand and gravel, advancing with a momentum that nothing on the bare continents can stop. The water pushes inland, drowning the low coastal valleys before the rotation of the Earth pulls it violently back out to sea. This massive, daily friction between water and stone is not just a geological curiosity. It is the fundamental engine driving the biological future of the planet. The dead, red continents are acting as a planetary scale quarry, and the moon is the mechanism of extraction. As the immense tides rush in and out, they scour the old red sandstone. They dissolve the iron, the calcium, and the phosphorus that the rain has washed down from the jagged mountains. The tides pull these vital minerals off the barren land and distribute them outward into the warm, shallow, sunlit waters of the continental margins. This is the profound connection between the silent land and the vibrant sea. Without tectonic uplift, there would be no raw rock exposed to the atmosphere. Without torrential rain, that rock would not be broken down. And without the immense gravitational pull of a closer moon, those dissolved minerals would never be dragged into the ocean in such massive quantities. The desolate, lifeless continents are literally feeding the warm nurseries of the sea. The water is saturated with the building blocks of life, harvested from the stone by the relentless rhythm of the sky. The Akkadian peaks continue to shatter under the rain. The moon rises, massive and pale, pulling the ocean inland yet again. It is a landscape defined entirely by raw, mechanical physics. There is no comfort here, no shade, and no green. The land is waiting. But beneath the surface of the rushing tide, in the warm, mineral-rich water, the harvest of the stone is being put to use. The empty continents provide the architecture. The ocean will build the life. To stand upon the barren coast of Laurussia is to be immediately confronted by the invisible weight of the sky. In the modern world, the atmosphere is something that goes largely unnoticed, a thin and transparent medium through which life moves freely. But 419 million years ago, the air is a physical presence. It presses against the bare rock and rests upon the surface of the global ocean with a heavy, heavy density. This is not the crisp, nitrogen and oxygen-balanced mixture that will one day support mammals and birds. It is a primal, thick vapor, loaded with chemical potential and holding the entire planet in a relentless thermal grip. The Devonian sky is a greenhouse operating at maximum capacity. The primary architect of this heavy atmosphere is carbon dioxide. While the modern world measures this gas in hundreds of parts per million, the Devonian air holds it in concentrations approaching 4,000 parts per million. This staggering volume of carbon acts as a perfect, invisible mirror to thermal radiation. When the sunlight penetrates the hazy sky and strikes the surface of the Panthalassic Ocean, the water absorbs the energy and attempts to radiate it back out into the cold vacuum of space as heat. But the heavy carbon blanket intercepts this outward-bound energy. It traps the heat, bouncing it back down to the surface in a continuous, compounding cycle. The heat cannot escape. The planet is entirely insulated. The physical result of this trapped energy is an environment of extreme, inescapable warmth. There is no winter here. There are no seasons defined by snow or frost. The surface temperature of the vast tropical oceans hovers near 30 degrees Celsius, making the water as warm as a drawn bath. From this immense, heated surface, evaporation occurs on a staggering scale. Millions of tons of water vapor rise continuously into the lower atmosphere, thickening the air even further. This water vapor is itself a potent greenhouse gas, locking the planet into a self-sustaining feedback loop of heat and humidity. The air feels wet, heavy, and deeply stagnant, holding moisture until it simply cannot absorb another drop. When the atmosphere finally reaches its breaking point, it forms storms of a magnitude that the modern Earth rarely sees. Fueled by the endless heat of the ocean surface and unobstructed by any tall forests or complex topography, massive cyclonic systems gather over the water. These hypercanes span thousands of miles. They drag the warm, humid air upward into towering anvils of dark, bruised cloud. The friction within these massive storm systems generates continuous, spectacular electrical discharges. Lightning arcs across the empty sky, illuminating the rolling, gray landscape of the ocean in bright flashes of violet and white. The thunder is a deep resonance, a low, continuous rumble that rolls unimpeded across the barren continents. And then the rain falls. But the rain of the early Devonian is fundamentally different from the pure, fresh water that nourishes modern forests. As the water droplets condense and fall through the thick atmosphere, they absorb the massive concentrations of carbon dioxide, forming a weak but highly effective carbonic acid. This is our acidic rain. It falls in heavy, warm sheets, striking the raw, oxidized iron and silicate rock of the Akkadian mountains. It does not simply wash the dust away. It chemically attacks the bedrock. If one could observe this process at a microscopic level, the rain striking the rock is a profound chemical reaction. The acidic water dissolves the mineral bonds holding the stone together. It eats away at the calcium, the magnesium, and the phosphorus embedded in the continental crust. This is the slow, relentless process of chemical weathering, operating at a planetary scale. The mountains are literally dissolving under the heavy, toxic sky. The resulting liquid, a rich, chemical slurry of dissolved stone, flows downhill, guided by gravity into the shallow, waiting seas. The heavy atmosphere is actively dismantling the land to feed the ocean. To breathe this air would be in difficult physical adjustment. An observer stepping into this environment would immediately begin to hyperventilate. Despite the overwhelming thickness of the atmosphere, the actual concentration of oxygen is incredibly low, hovering at perhaps half of modern levels. A human heart would race, attempting to pump enough of the scarce oxygen to the brain, while the lungs would heave against the heavy, wet heat. The sensory experience would be dominated by smells that the modern world associates with harsh industrial processes or electrical fires. The air smells sharply of ozone from the constant lightning strikes. It smells of raw, wet dust. It smells of minerals slowly dissolving in acid. It is an atmosphere that is utterly hostile to complex terrestrial life. Yet, this hostility is entirely a matter of perspective. For the creatures currently inhabiting the planet, this thick, hot, low-oxygen world is not a hostile world. It is a paradise. The jawless fish and the armored trilobites do not breathe the air. They extract dissolved oxygen directly from the water using gills. And for cold-blooded marine life, the intense, uniform heat of the greenhouse ocean is a massive biological advantage. It accelerates their metabolic rates. They grow faster. They process food faster. They reproduce with astonishing speed. The heavy blanket of carbon dioxide that would kill a modern mammal is the exact engine driving the steady, accelerating pace of Devonian evolution. The ocean is teeming with life precisely because the sky above it is so heavy. The true frontier of this world exists at the very edge of the water, where the acidic rain meets the breaking waves and the bare rock. Here, the landscape is not entirely dead. Clinging to the wet stones, sheltered in the microscopic crevices where the acidic rain pools, are biological crusts. They are communities of cyanobacteria, algae, and primitive fungi, forming thin, slippery films of dark green and black across the coastal margins. They have no roots. They have no leaves. They are barely visible to the naked eye. But these fragile, creeping films represent an unimaginable evolutionary ambition. They are breathing the heavy carbon dioxide, using the unfiltered sunlight to slowly assemble sugars. They are enduring the acidic rain and the intense ultraviolet radiation that penetrates the hazy sky. They are the absolute vanguard of life on land. As the massive tides pull back, leaving the rock exposed to the heavy air, these microbial mats quietly hold their ground. They are waiting for a biological breakthrough, a structural innovation that will allow them to stand upright against the heavy sky. The ocean has reached its limits. The conquest of the hostile, breathless continents is about to begin. As the massive tides of the Panthalassic Ocean retreat, they reveal a landscape that is slowly, hesitantly transforming. The bare, oxidized red rock, described by earlier eons, is no longer entirely naked, moving inland, away from the immediate force of the crashing waves and into the low floodplains. A creeping green hue begins to soften the harsh geometry of the stone. This is not a forest. If an observer were to walk across this early Devonian plain, they would not find themselves walking under a canopy. They would be looking down at their feet. The vanguard of terrestrial plant life is incredibly small, a delicate carpet of simple, branching stems that rarely reach higher than a human ankle. These are the rhiniophytes, the pioneers of the soil. These early vascular plants, like Cooksonia, possess a biology that is elegant but severely restricted. They have no leaves to capture the sunlight. They have no true roots to anchor them deeply or draw water from subterranean aquifers. Instead, they rely on horizontal, underground stems that creep just beneath the surface of the damp mud. They are entirely dependent on proximity to the waterways, hugging the margins of the rivers and the shallow pools left behind by the rain. To look across this landscape is to see a two-dimensional world of green, a thin biological film stretched tight over the immense geology of the continent. It is a world entirely devoid of shade. The heavy, hazy sun beats down upon the low stems without mercy. But as the observer continues across the low plains, scanning the flat horizon, something impossible breaks the geometry of the red stone. Rising abruptly from the damp earth are massive, solitary pillars. They do not grow in dense clusters like modern trees, but stand scattered across the landscape like solitary obelisks erected by an unseen civilization. As one approaches these structures, the scale of them becomes strikingly apparent. Some of these spires reach towering heights of 8 meters, with trunks nearly a meter thick at the base. They cast long, heavy shadows across the tiny, creeping rhiniophytes below. In a world where nothing else grows taller than a few centimeters, these towering columns are the undisputed giants of the terrestrial earth. Yet, these monolithic structures are not trees. They have no branches extending outward to catch the light. They have no canopy of leaves. They do not produce seeds or flowers. If an observer were to press a hand against the dark, textured surface of the massive trunk, it would not feel like the rigid, splintering bark of an oak. It would feel slightly yielding, dense, and perhaps damp to the touch. This towering organism is known to paleontologists as Prototaxites, and it represents one of the most bizarre and spectacular evolutionary experiments in the history of the planet. Prototaxites is a fungus. It is difficult for the modern mind to reconcile the concept of a fungus with a structure the size of a telephone pole. The fungi of the modern world are largely confined to the shadows, decomposing fallen logs or pushing up small mushrooms after a heavy rain. But in the early Devonian, the rules of the biological hierarchy have not yet been settled. The plants have not yet invented the rigid structural polymer called wood, and therefore cannot grow tall. Prototaxites exploits this vertical emptiness. Its massive trunk is composed of millions of microscopic fungal tubes known as hyphae, woven together with such incredible density that they form a rigid, load-bearing column capable of defying gravity and withstanding the howling Devonian winds. To stand beneath the shadow of a prototaxite spire is to experience an atmosphere of profound and eerie alienation. There is an absolute stillness to these giants. Unlike a tree, which interacts dynamically with its environment, its leaves rustling, its branches swaying, its canopy serving as a habitat for countless insects, Prototaxites stands in absolute silence. There are no birds to sing in its non-existent branches. There are no flying insects to buzz around its summit. It is a monument of pure, silent biology. The air around it carries a distinct earthy scent, the sharp tang of active decomposition and fungal spores hanging heavy in the hot, humid carbon dioxide. The dominance of prototaxites reveals a unique insight into the mechanics of the early Earth. Why did a fungus rule the continents before the plants? The answer lies in the harshness of the rock. The rhiniophytes, with their simple underground stems, struggled to extract essential minerals from the raw stone. But fungi are the ultimate chemical engineers of the natural world. Their microscopic hyphae secrete powerful acids that can dissolve solid rock, breaking down the minerals and absorbing them directly. Prototaxites likely fed on the decaying microbial mats, the dying rhiniophytes, and the bedrock of the continent itself. It grew massive because it had no competition for the vertical space, and because no herbivore had yet evolved the specialized mouthparts to eat it. It was untouchable. While the massive spires of prototaxites dominate the visual landscape, an equally critical fungal empire is expanding beneath the surface. The tiny vascular plants and the fungi are engaged in an act of profound chemical diplomacy. The plants are capable of pulling carbon dioxide from the air and using the sunlight to synthesize sugars, but they are starving for minerals. The fungi are master miners of minerals, but they cannot produce their own energy. And so, in the dark, damp earth beneath the spires, they connect. The fungal hyphae physically penetrate the underground stems of the plants, creating a biological trade network. Minerals flow up from the stone. Sugars flow down from the sun. This underground alliance, the mycorrhizal network, is the true foundation of the terrestrial ecosystem. It is a partnership forged in the harsh, uncompromising environment of the early Devonian, and it is so overwhelmingly successful that it will endure for hundreds of millions of years. Almost every forest that will ever stand upon the earth, from the ancient coal swamps to the modern Amazon, will rely on this exact same invisible architecture of fungal trade. Prototaxites may be the visible king of the landscape, but it is the quiet, subterranean fungal networks that are truly terraforming the planet, slowly turning the dead rock into the first true living soils. Periodically, the great spires of prototaxites complete their reproductive cycle. From the immense vertical surface of the fungal column, microscopic pores open to the humid air. Without a sound, billions of spores are released into the wind. They form a fine, pale mist that drifts across the red plains like a biological smoke. The heavy Devonian breeze carries this living dust for hundreds of miles, coating the creeping plants and settling into the damp mud to begin the cycle again. The age of the forest is still tens of millions of years away. For now, the continents belong to the silence, the damp earth, and the towering monuments of the fungi, while the massive fungal spires of prototaxites stand silent watch over the creeping green margins of the land. The true explosion of Devonian complexity is happening beneath the waves. As the period progresses into its middle stages, the global climate achieves a state of extreme, sustained greenhouse stability. The vast, shallow continental shelves surrounding Laurussia and Gondwana are constantly bathed in intense sunlight and flushed with the mineral-rich runoff from the crumbling red mountains. These warm, shallow seas become the staging ground for the largest biological construction project in the history of the Earth. It is an architectural endeavor that spans entire continents, executed entirely by organisms that possess neither brains nor eyes. The scale of this construction is difficult to grasp. In the modern world, the Great Barrier Reef is considered a planetary marvel. But in the Middle Devonian, continuous barrier reefs stretch for thousands of miles along the coastlines of what will eventually become Western Australia, Northern Europe, and Western North America. In some regions, these living walls rise hundreds of feet from the seafloor, forming sheer vertical cliffs of biological limestone that plunge into the darker, colder depths of the open ocean. On the landward side, they enclose immense protected lagoons, sheltering thousands of square miles of calm, shallow water from the relentless mechanical energy of the open sea. To descend through the warm, clear water above one of these Devonian reefs is to enter a complex, towering metropolis. The sunlight fractures across the rippling surface, projecting a constantly shifting net of bright gold over a landscape of staggering geometric complexity. The water is not silent. It carries the continuous, low-frequency vibration of heavy ocean currents rushing through millions of tiny channels, crevices, and porous structures. The reef is a labyrinth of domes, branching columns, and intricate, honeycomb terraces, stacked upon each other in a desperate, slow-motion race toward the light. Yet, the most profound realization about this ancient ecosystem lies in its biological identity. It functions exactly like a modern coral reef, providing the same structural foundation and ecological niches. But almost nothing building this Devonian wall is related to the soft polyps that construct the reefs of the modern ocean. Separated by hundreds of millions of years, life has independently arrived at the exact same architectural solution to the problem of surviving in a high-energy, shallow-water environment. The Devonian Sea has invented the coral reef using a completely different set of biological tools. The primary architects of these massive underwater fortresses are not corals at all. They are an extinct group of hypercalcified sea sponges known as Stromatoporoids. Unlike the soft, yielding sponges that inhabit modern reefs, Stromatoporoids secrete dense, heavily layered skeletons of solid calcium carbonate. They grow in enormous, heavy domes, some reaching the size of small vehicles. They anchor themselves directly to the rocky substrate and expand outward, layer by microscopic layer, season after season. For centuries, these massive, patient domes form the structural core of the reef. They are the heavy foundational blocks capable of withstanding the immense horizontal force of the Devonian storm waves. The process by which these brainless organisms build their fortresses is a marvel of microscopic engineering. Operating at the cellular level, the living tissue of the sponge continually pumps the warm, mineral-saturated seawater through its internal chambers. It extracts dissolved calcium and carbonate ions directly from the fluid, forcing them to precipitate and crystallize into rigid stone beneath its living skin. It is literally pulling the raw material of the dissolved mountains out of the water and reassembling it into a living wall. Over millions of years, this microscopic chemical extraction locks away unimaginable quantities of carbon and calcium, fundamentally altering the chemistry of the global ocean. But a massive wall cannot be built from heavy domes alone. It requires scaffolding to reach the light, and it requires mortar to hold the disparate pieces together against the relentless pull of the tide. Working alongside the giant Stromatoporoids is a supporting cast of entirely extinct corals. The tabulate corals grow in colonial structures that often resemble delicate, branching candelabras or tightly packed hexagonal honeycombs. They grow upward rapidly, filling the vertical spaces between the massive sponge domes and creating complex multi-tiered terraces. The rugose corals, often called horn corals for their distinctive cone-like shapes, grow both as solitary individuals and as tightly packed colonies, adding their own rigid, cup-shaped skeletons to the accumulating mass. What makes the Devonian reef so extraordinarily successful is its sophisticated division of labor. Ecologists refer to the different roles organisms play in building a reef as guilds. There are constructors, which build the primary framework. There are binders, which cement the loose pieces together. And there are bafflers, which slow the movement of water and trap suspended sediment. The Devonian reefs possess all of these guilds in perfect, functioning harmony. The massive Stromatoporoids act as the constructors, encrusting algae and specialized cyanobacteria spread across the dead surfaces of the coral and sponge, acting as biological binders that literally cement the rubble into a single, cohesive, unbreakable unit. The branching tabulate corals act as bafflers. As the heavy, sediment-laden currents rush through their delicate branches, the water is forced to slow down. The suspended particles of sand and mud drop out of the water column, settling into the quiet pockets created by the coral branches. This trapped sediment eventually solidifies, filling the gaps in the reef framework and turning a porous structure into a solid, impenetrable mountain of limestone. It is a self-sustaining cycle of growth, baffling, and binding that allows the reef to rise higher and push further out into the open ocean. By manipulating the flow of water and creating a vast, three-dimensional architecture of stone, these blind builders transform the flat, featureless continental shelf into the most complex habitat on the planet. The deep crevices, the overhanging ledges, and the twisting tunnels offer infinite hiding places and ambush points. They create an environment that rewards maneuverability, specialized feeding strategies, and advanced sensory perception. The reef has been built, the stage is set, and waiting in the shadows of the massive sponge domes are the creatures that will push the boundaries of vertebrate evolution to their absolute limits. For tens of millions of years, the vertebrate animals of the ancient oceans operate under a severe mechanical limitation. The jawless fish, despite their diverse array of armored plates and sensory organs, are fundamentally restricted by their anatomy. Their mouths are essentially fixed, open apertures. They cannot grasp a moving target. They cannot bite through the hard shell of an arthropod or tear flesh from a larger carcass. They are restricted to filtering microscopic plankton from the water column or slowly vacuuming soft organic detritus from the muddy seafloor. It is a passive, gentle existence, perfectly suited to a peaceful ocean. But as the towering Stromatoporoid reefs begin to dominate the continental shelves, creating a complex, crowded, and highly competitive three-dimensional world. The passive strategy reaches its breaking point. To survive in the labyrinth of the reef, an organism must be able to exploit new resources. It must be able to extract the protein hidden inside the armored shells of the trilobites. It needs a mechanism to actively dismantle the world around it. The Devonian period delivers this mechanism through one of the most profound anatomical repurposings in the history of life. The evolutionary leap that changes the trajectory of the planet does not begin with the lips, and it does not begin with teeth. The jaw is invented by the respiratory system. Behind the simple, open mouth of a jawless fish lies a series of vertical, cartilaginous rods. These are the gill arches. Their original function is purely structural. They hold the gill slits open, ensuring that the warm, low-oxygen seawater can flow steadily over the delicate respiratory tissues. But in the crowded, fiercely competitive nurseries of the early Devonian, evolution begins to tinker with this architecture. The first pair of these gill arches, located closest to the mouth, begins to enlarge. It develops a flexible hinge in the middle and acquires a more robust network of muscles. Initially, this modification has nothing to do with eating. The hinged gill arch acts as a muscular pump. By opening and closing the arch, the fish can forcefully draw a larger volume of water into its mouth and push it aggressively over the gills. In the stifling greenhouse heat of the Devonian Ocean, where dissolved oxygen is incredibly scarce, this pumping mechanism is a massive advantage for survival. But biology is driven by unintended consequences. As this muscular, hinged arch becomes stronger and more pronounced, it edges closer to the opening of the mouth. Eventually, the pump becomes a pair of jaws. The moment the first hinged arch snaps shut with enough force to grip a struggling prey item, the entire ecological hierarchy of the planet is permanently rewritten. The mouth is no longer just a passive funnel for microscopic particles. It is a dynamic tool. For the first time in the history of the Earth, a vertebrate animal can manipulate its environment. It can actively grasp, crush, and tear. More importantly, the jaw allows an organism to consume prey that is physically larger than the circumference of its own throat. The era of the filter feeder begins its slow decline, and the age of the active predator rapidly begins. The undisputed pioneers of this new, aggressive architecture are a class of heavily armored fish known as the Placoderms. They are visually formidable creatures, perfectly adapted to the harsh realities of the Devonian reef. The Placoderms retain the heavy external bone plating of their jawless ancestors, but they concentrated exclusively on the front half of their bodies. The head and the thorax are encased in thick, overlapping shields of solid bone, providing impenetrable defense against attacks from rival predators. The rear half of the body, however, is entirely different. It is naked, cartilaginous, and heavily muscled, ending in a powerful, asymmetrical tail. This hybrid anatomy dictates their entire existence. The heavy bone armor makes them incredibly dense, meaning they are poor, long-distance swimmers. They do not cruise the open ocean looking for prey. Instead, they are the ultimate ambush predators. The Placoderms utilize the chaotic architecture of the reef, hovering silently in the dark crevices and caves created by the massive Stromatoporoid sponges. Their heavily armored heads blend in perfectly with the surrounding rock. They wait with infinite patience, using their newly evolved lateral line systems to detect the subtle vibrations of a trilobite or a smaller fish moving through the water column. When the Placoderm strikes, it utilizes a specialized mechanical advantage that makes it devastatingly effective. The armor covering its head is not fused solidly to the armor covering its thorax. There is a specialized articulating joint located at the back of the neck. When the Placoderm opens its mouth to attack, it does not simply drop its lower jaw. The neck joint allows the entire upper skull to simultaneously snap swiftly upward. This double hinge mechanism creates a sudden, massive vertical gape in a fraction of a second. The resulting vacuum instantly sucks the unsuspecting prey directly into the grasp of the predator. But the most striking aspect of the placoderm jaw is its lack of true teeth. They have not yet evolved the conical, enamel-coated teeth that will define later predators. Instead, the placoderm relies on the sheer, brutal geometry of the jawbone itself. The edges of the upper and lower jaw plates are exposed, razor-sharp, and perfectly aligned. As the massive jaw muscles contract, the bony plates slide past each other like the blades of a giant industrial shear. Furthermore, the friction of the plates grinding against one another constantly sharpens the bone, ensuring that the placoderm always possesses a sharp, precise edge. With the rise of the placoderms, the ocean ceases to be a peaceful garden of passive consumption. The introduction of the jaw accelerates the flow of energy through the ecosystem, and it ignites an explosive planetary arms race. The prey must adapt immediately or face total annihilation. Trilobites begin to evolve thicker, more complex shells covered in defensive spines. Other fish begin to shed their heavy, cumbersome armor in favor of sleek, hydrodynamically efficient bodies, trading defense for the raw speed necessary to escape the snap of the placoderm shear. The entire Devonian ocean is suddenly driven by the brutal calculus of predator and prey, a high-speed biological war being fought in the shadows of the silent, towering reefs. While the placoderms wage their armored struggles in the shallow, sunlit reefs, the silent, damp continents are undergoing an equally profound structural revolution. Tens of millions of years have passed since the first tiny, creeping rhiniophytes established their fragile beachheads along the muddy coastal margins. The land is no longer a two-dimensional film of green stretched over bare rock. The stark, horizontal geometry of the early Devonian is being broken. Driven by the relentless competition for sunlight and forced to compete with the towering fungal spires of Prototaxites, the plants have solved the mechanical problem of gravity. They have invented wood. At a molecular level, this breakthrough relies on a complex new organic polymer called lignin. It is a material of staggering strength and rigidity. By incorporating lignin into their cellular walls, the plants are no longer restricted to creeping along the damp mud or relying on internal water pressure to stand upright. They can now build freestanding, load-bearing columns capable of resisting both the downward pull of gravity and the sheer ripping force of the massive Devonian storms. The plants are constructing their own biological bedrock, allowing them to finally reach toward the heavy sky. But building a towering vertical structure requires an equally aggressive subterranean architecture. To support a massive wooden trunk, the simple, horizontal underground stems of the early plants are no longer sufficient. The plants evolved true, penetrating roots. These are not merely anchors. They are specialized, biological mining drills. They force their way deep into the microscopic cracks of the old red sandstone. As the roots grow and expand, they exert immense physical pressure, literally splitting the solid bedrock apart. Operating in tandem with the acidic chemical weathering, these deep root systems rapidly accelerate the destruction of the continental rock, grinding it down into the first thick, nutrient-rich soils. With a secure foundation and a rigid wooden trunk, the plants are finally capable of maximizing their exposure to the sun. However, the evolution of the broad, flat leaf presents a strange physiological paradox. Why did the plants wait tens of millions of years to develop a structure so obviously beneficial for photosynthesis? The answer lies in the oppressive Devonian atmosphere. In the extreme, heavy greenhouse heat of the earlier epochs, a large, flat leaf would have functioned like a solar oven, absorbing so much thermal radiation that the plant would literally perish in the heat. It is only now, as the carbon dioxide levels begin a slow, marginal decline, that the atmosphere cools just enough to allow the deployment of the first true leaves. The undisputed master of this new vertical world is a towering organism known as Archaeopteris. It is the Eartha-Euro-S first true tree. To stand at the base of an Archaeopteris is to look up at a massive, woody trunk that closely resembles modern conifer wood, reaching heights of up to 30 meters. But the canopy branching out from this familiar trunk is deeply alien. It is not crowned with the broad, flat leaves of an oak, nor the sharp needles of a pine. The branches of Archaeopteris are draped in massive, elegant fronds, resembling the delicate, deeply lobed foliage of a giant fern. When thousands of these towering fern trees grow together, they create a phenomenon that the planet has never experienced before: a forest canopy. The interlocking fronds intercept the harsh, unfiltered sunlight, casting a deep, continuous shadow over the forest floor. This shade fundamentally alters the local environment. It traps the moisture evaporating from the damp soil, creating a permanent, cool, and highly humid microclimate beneath the branches. The baking, exposed, and hostile environment of the barren rock has been replaced by a sheltered, three-dimensional sanctuary. Despite its towering, majestic scale, this early forest is an eerily quiet and aesthetically austere environment. There are no vibrant explosions of color. The genetic architecture for flowers and fruits does not yet exist. The landscape is a monochrome study in deep greens and the dark, textured brown of woody bark. There is no birdsong drifting through the canopy, nor the frantic buzzing of pollinating insects. Archaeopteris, like the fungi before it, reproduces by shedding billions of microscopic spores. During the reproductive season, the heavy, damp air is choked with a pale, drifting mist of spores, coating the forest floor in a fine, yellow dust. In the deep, permanent shade of this new canopy, the old biological order quietly collapses. Prototaxites, the towering fungal spire that once dominated the open plains, finds itself entirely outmaneuvered. The fungus cannot survive without the direct, unobstructed sunlight that once baked the open rock, and it cannot compete with the aggressive, deep, mining root systems of the new trees. Slowly, the giant spires rot away and disappear from the fossil record. The fungi retreat back into the damp soil and the shadows of the fallen wood, returning to their role as the quiet, indispensable recyclers of the ecosystem. The plants have definitively won the vertical war, but the triumph of the forest carries a profound planetary consequence. These immense, continent-spanning forests are biological engines designed to consume carbon. They pull staggering quantities of carbon dioxide out of the heavy Devonian atmosphere, using the solar energy to crack the molecules and weave the carbon into their rigid, lignin-fortified trunks. Because the bacteria and fungi of the Devonian have not yet fully evolved the ability to break down and digest this massive volume of newly invented wood, the fallen trees do not rot efficiently. Millions of tons of solid carbon are buried in the muddy, anoxic swamps, permanently removed from the atmospheric cycle. This massive, relentless carbon sequestration fundamentally destabilizes the global climate. The thick, insulating greenhouse blanket that has kept the Devonian oceans teeming with life begins to thin and fracture. As the carbon dioxide levels plummet, the atmosphere loses its ability to trap the thermal radiation of the sun. The extreme, heavy heat of the early Devonian begins a slow, irreversible decline. The trees, simply by growing and competing for the light, are inadvertently refrigerating the entire planet. The vast, warm, shallow seas are entirely dependent on this heat, and the shadows of the first forests are casting a long, cold chill over the future of the ocean. For the first time in the history of the planet, the surface of the continents offers an unimaginable wealth of biological energy. The towering forests of Archaeopteris are continuously shedding massive fern-like fronds, woody branches, and billions of microscopic spores. Because the bacteria and fungi of the Devonian are still struggling to efficiently digest the newly invented lignin, this organic debris simply accumulates. The forest floor is buried under a thick, damp layer of rotting vegetation. It is a vast, unexploited reservoir of calories, sitting in the deep, cool shadows of the canopy. And just a few yards away, in the shallow coastal waters and estuaries, an army of hungry, highly motivated organisms is waiting for the opportunity to claim it. The pressure to leave the water is immense. The shallow margins of the Devonian Ocean are no longer the peaceful, passive environments they once were. The placoderms and other early jawed fish are patrolling the reefs, utilizing their striking new mechanical shearing jaws to devastating effect. To remain in the water is to be in constant peril. The damp, shadowy world of the forest floor offers an absolute sanctuary from the armored predators and an endless buffet of decaying plant matter. But crossing the boundary between water and air requires an organism to solve two severe physics problems simultaneously: the crushing force of terrestrial gravity and the immediate threat of desiccation. The first creatures to successfully solve these problems and launch a permanent invasion of the continents are not the ancestors of modern reptiles or mammals. The conquest of the land belongs entirely to the arthropods. Long before any fish manages to pull itself onto the muddy banks, a silent, creeping army of jointed, multi-legged invertebrates begins to infiltrate the rotting margins of the Devonian forests. It is not a sudden, dramatic migration. It is a slow, generational shift, moving incrementally from the wet mud of the tidal zones into the deeper, permanent shadows of the giant roots. The success of the arthropods is driven by one of the most remarkable examples of evolutionary preadaptation in biological history. Millions of years earlier, in the violent environment of the ocean, the ancestors of these creatures evolved a hard external shell made of chitin. This exoskeleton was originally designed as armor to defend against the teeth of predators and to provide structural support against the resistance of the water. But when an arthropod steps out of the water and into the air, this exact same armor accidentally functions as the perfect biological spacesuit. The watertight exoskeleton prevents the dry air from evaporating the vital fluids within, solving the problem of desiccation. Simultaneously, its rigid architecture provides a structural scaffold that perfectly resists the downward pull of gravity without the need for an internal skeleton. They arrive on land already equipped to survive it. However, surviving the air requires more than just armor. It requires a new mechanism for extracting oxygen. Gills, which are designed to filter dissolved oxygen from water, collapse under their own weight when exposed to the air, causing the organism to deplete. The terrestrial arthropods bypass this problem entirely. They develop spiracles, a series of microscopic, muscular valves running along the sides of their armored bodies. These valves open directly into a network of internal, branching tubes called tracheae, which pipe the atmospheric oxygen directly into the tissues and muscles. They do not need lungs. They breathe through the armor itself. The vanguard of this six-legged invasion consists primarily of detritivores, primitive millipedes, some no larger than a grain of rice, and early, wingless hexapods resembling modern springtails swarm into the decaying leaf litter. They are the essential garbage collectors of the new terrestrial world. They chew through the rotting fronds of Archaeopteris, breaking down the tough plant fibers and returning the processed nutrients to the muddy earth. Their relentless consumption accelerates the breakdown of the massive carbon deposits, creating the rich, complex soils that will allow the forest to spread even further inland. But the fundamental rule of biology is that wherever energy gathers, predators will inevitably follow. Once the detritivores establish a thriving population in the damp leaf litter, the terrestrial food web expands to include violence. Following closely behind, the millipedes are the early arachnids. These are the trigonotarbids, formidable, heavily armored, spider-like creatures that lack the ability to spin silk, but possess devastatingly powerful jaws. Alongside them come the first terrestrial centipedes, sleek, multi-segmented hunters designed for speed and maneuverability in the tight, dark spaces between the rotting logs. The arrival of these predators introduces the concept of the hunt to the dry continents. An arms race ignites in the shadows. The terrestrial ecosystem is suddenly injected with the chemistry of venom. The trigonotarbids and centipedes lie in wait beneath the decaying wood, using the vibrations of the damp earth to track the movements of the grazing millipedes. The forest floor becomes a miniature, complex jungle, operating entirely independent of the massive trees above. It is a world of silent ambushes, swift strikes, and the urgent scuttling of prey attempting to escape through the complex architecture of the leaf litter. With the establishment of this complex, multi-tiered society, the sensory environment of the forest changes fundamentally. For millions of years, the soundscape of the continents consisted only of the wind howling through the rocky canyons or rustling the fronds of the early trees. Now, the silence is permanently broken by the acoustic signature of animal life. If one were to press an ear to the damp earth, the noise would be unmistakable. It is the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of thousands of chitinous legs. It is the subtle rustle of dead fronds shifting. It is the microscopic, continuous crunch of tiny jaws processing the rotting wood. The terrestrial circuit is finally complete. The energy of the sun, captured by the massive fronds of the canopy, flows downward into the decaying litter, where it is consumed by the millipedes, which are in turn hunted and consumed by the arachnids. The silent, barren rock of the early Devonian has been entirely terraformed into a functioning, deeply interconnected biological machine. The arthropods rule the shadows, holding uncontested dominion over the forest floor. But their monopoly will not last. In the shallow, oxygen-starved waters at the edge of the forest, the vertebrates are watching. The relentless expansion of the Archaeopteris forests fundamentally alters not only the continents, but also the bodies of water that cut across them. The rivers, estuaries, and shallow coastal swamps of the late Devonian are transformed into environments of extreme biological tension. Before the trees, these waterways were relatively clear, flowing over bare rock and sand. Now, they are completely choked with the debris of the massive forests. Fallen wooden trunks, dying roots, and millions of tons of shed fern fronds accumulate in the slow-moving, shallow waters, creating a tangled, submerged labyrinth. This massive influx of organic matter triggers a profound chemical reaction within the water. As the warm, stagnant water begins to break down the sheer volume of dead wood and vegetation, the populations of decomposing bacteria explode. In their frantic consumption of the forest debris, these bacteria strip the surrounding water of its dissolved oxygen. The shallow swamps and choked river systems become deeply anoxic. The water is hot, dark with tannins, and utterly heavy. For the fish trapped in these environments, their traditional anatomy becomes a fatal liability. The gills, perfected over millions of years to extract oxygen from the ocean, are useless in a liquid that has no oxygen left to give. The fish are drowning in the water. To survive in this breathless frontier, biology must engineer a radical new solution. The evolutionary response to the stagnant swamp is one of the most misunderstood adaptations in the history of life. There is a common assumption that fish evolved lungs specifically to conquer the land, but the fossil record reveals a much more desperate reality. The lung is not a tool designed for terrestrial exploration. It is a survival mechanism invented to prevent asphyxiation in the water. Evolution does not look forward to the dry continents. It reacts blindly to the immediate pressure of the Anoxic swamp. The mechanism of this early lung is remarkably simple. It begins as a small, muscular, outpocketing extending from the esophagus, essentially a pouch lined with a dense network of blood vessels. When the dissolved oxygen in the stagnant water drops to severe levels, the fish is forced to change its behavior. It must leave the safety of the dark bottom and swim upward. It breaches the surface tension of the water, opens its jaw, and physically gulps the heavy, humid air of the Devonian atmosphere. The oxygen diffuses across the vascular lining of the pouch directly into the bloodstream, bypassing the useless gills entirely. This simple act of surfacing to breathe represents a profound shift in the relationship between the vertebrate and the sky. For hundreds of millions of years, the surface of the water was a hard boundary, an absolute ceiling that fish never needed to cross. Now, it is a lifeline. If an observer were to watch the surface of a late Devonian swamp, the stillness would be continually broken by the dark, heavy heads of lobe-finned fish rising to the air. There is the sudden break of the water, the wet, desperate gasp, the sealing of the jaw, and the quiet slip back into the murky, heavy depths. But breathing the air is only half the battle. Navigating the ruined, wood-choked environment of the swamp requires a completely different mode of locomotion. The delicate, translucent ray fins that allow open ocean fish to dart and glide with such elegance are instantly shredded in the tangled mess of sunken logs and submerged root systems. To move through this dense, physical obstacle course, the fins must become muscular and robust. The lobe-finned fish, known as sarcopterygians, evolve thick, fleshy appendages, supported by a complex internal architecture of heavy bones. These are not just fins for swimming. They are biological levers, designed to push, haul, and drag the heavy body through the tangled vegetation. As these heavily armored, air-breathing, muscular fish adapt to the extreme shallows, their physical geometry begins to warp. The classic torpedo-shaped profile of the open-water predator is useless in water that is only a few inches deep. The apex predators of the swamp, creatures like Tiktaalik, develop bizarre, flattened skulls. They look less like fish and more like heavy, scaled crocodiles. This flattened architecture allows them to operate in the absolute shallows, hunting in the transitional zone where the muddy water meets the damp earth. Because they are operating in this shallow, two-dimensional plane, their sensory orientation shifts dramatically. The eyes of these swamp predators migrate from the sides of their heads, where they would only stare into the murky mud, to the very top of their flat skulls. They are no longer looking down into the depths. They are looking up. They are watching the surface of the water, waiting for the shadows of the terrestrial arthropods that now dominate the overhanging forest canopy. The hunter's gaze has turned toward the land. To hunt effectively at the water's edge, these creatures develop another unprecedented anatomical feature: a flexible neck. In a standard fish, the bones of the skull are solidly fused to the bones of the shoulder girdle. A fish cannot turn its head without turning its entire body. But in the tight, chaotic confines of the submerged forest, where a sudden strike is required to capture a scuttling centipede or a falling millipede, a fused neck is a severe disadvantage. The bones connecting the skull to the shoulders detach. For the first time, a vertebrate animal can independently turn its head to track prey moving along the shoreline. The creatures inhabiting the breathless frontier exist in a state of exquisite, intense biological tension. They are fundamentally fish, bound to the water for reproduction and hydration, but the water is actively pushing them away, heavy them with the rotting debris of the forest, and the land, loud with the mechanical clicking of the arthropod empire, is pulling them forward with the promise of uncontested calories. They wait in the muddy shallows, breathing the air, looking at the forest, and dragging themselves over the submerged logs on strong, bony limbs. The boundary has been breached. The final transition is inevitable. The boundary between the aquatic world and the terrestrial continents is not a sharp, defining line. In the late Devonian, it is a blurred, muddy margin, extending for thousands of miles beneath the deep shade of the Archaeopteris forests. It is an environment of extreme shallows, where the water is measured in inches rather than feet, and where the heavy, rotting logs form physical ramps leading out of the Anoxic swamp and onto the damp earth. This is the staging ground for the most consequential physical crossing in the history of vertebrate life. If an observer were to wait with infinite patience along one of these muddy banks, the stillness of the shallow water would eventually be broken. It does not begin with a dramatic leap. It begins with a slow, deliberate haul. A creature drags itself over a submerged root, breaking the surface tension, and pushes its head and thorax into the heavy, humid air. This is Ichthyostega, one of the Eartho-Euro's first true tetrapods. To look at it is to see a biological chimera caught exactly in the middle of a planetary transition. It possesses the heavy, muscular tail of a fish, complete with a swimming fin, but extending from its shoulders and pelvis are four distinctly articulated, powerful limbs. The most shocking feature of these limbs is not their musculature, but what lies at the end of them. They do not terminate in the webbing of a fin. They terminate in distinct, separated digits. The evolution of fingers and toes provides a profound, counterintuitive insight into the mechanics of terrestrialization. There is a deeply ingrained assumption that digits evolved to allow animals to walk on land. The fossil record proves this entirely wrong. Creatures like Acanthostega, a close relative of Ichthyostega, possessed 8 perfectly formed fingers on each limb. Yet their anatomy proves they were entirely aquatic, incapable of supporting their weight on land. Fingers were not invented for walking. They were an aquatic invention designed to grip submerged roots and navigate the chaotic, three-dimensional tangle of the choked swamp floor. Walking on land is merely a beautiful, accidental exaptation of a tool designed for the water. But as Ichthyostega hauls its heavy, meter-long body completely out of the water and onto the exposed mud, the utility of those aquatic fingers is immediately repurposed. The moment the animal leaves the water, it loses the massive advantage of buoyancy. For its entire evolutionary history, the water has supported the mass of the vertebrate body. Now, in the dry air, gravity strikes the animal with the blunt, unrelenting force of a physical blow. The physics of survival change instantly. The internal architecture of the creature is thrown into a state of structural crisis. The vertebrate spine, which spent hundreds of millions of years evolving to flex fluidly from side to side to generate swimming thrust, suddenly sags downward. The heavy internal organs, no longer suspended in a liquid medium, pull violently against the connective tissues. To survive this crushing new reality, the skeleton must be radically engineered. The thin, delicate ribs of the fish must become thick, broad, and heavily overlapping, creating a rigid, bony cage. This rib cage acts as a suspension bridge, transferring the weight of the torso to the newly strengthened shoulder and pelvic girdles, preventing the animal from literally crushing its own lungs. The physical act of moving across the mudbank is incredibly slow and mechanically inefficient. It is not the graceful, alternating stride of a modern lizard. Ichthyostega moves through a series of heavy, exhausting heaves. The pelvic girdle is finally fused directly to the spine, allowing the powerful hind legs to transfer pushing force to the rest of the body. The animal plants its front feet, drags its hindquarters forward, and slides its heavy belly across the wet earth, leaving a deep, continuous trench in the mud. Every inch of forward progress is a challenging negotiation with gravity. This physical struggle is compounded by a profound sensory shock. The sensory organs of a fish are calibrated entirely for a liquid medium. As the tetrapod lifts its head into the air, its vision is suddenly distorted. In the water, the spherical lens of the eye does the heavy lifting of focusing light. But in the air, the refractive index changes completely. Until the cornea evolves to become the primary focusing surface, the terrestrial world appears to the early tetrapods as a harsh, intensely bright, and heavily blurred landscape. They are navigating the alien continents through a severe optical haze. Simultaneously, the acoustic world goes completely dark. Along the flanks of every fish is a lateral line, a network of highly sensitive organs designed to detect the subtle, low-frequency pressure waves of movement in the water. In the thin medium of the air, the lateral line is completely dead. The tetrapod is deaf to the rustling of the Archaeopteris fronds and the clicking of the giant millipedes. To fix this, evolution is forced to rip apart the architecture of the skull. A bone previously used to support the jaw, the hyomandibula, slowly detaches and begins to transmit airborne vibrations to the inner ear. It will eventually become the stapes, but for now, the first footsteps on land are taken in absolute silence. Why would an organism subject itself to this crushing gravity, this blurred vision, and this deafening silence? The answer lies a few feet away, grazing on a rotting log. The land is completely devoid of vertebrate predators, but it is teeming with the massive, slow-moving arthropods described in the previous era. Ichthyostega hauls itself forward, its heavy jaws parting. It lunges with a sudden, muscular snap, crushing a primitive millipede between its specialized, conical teeth. It is the first terrestrial vertebrate capture. The agonizing structural compromises are instantly validated. The calories of the continent, previously locked behind the barrier of the shoreline, have finally been claimed, its energy spent, and its skin beginning to dry dangerously in the heavy Devonian air. The tetrapod slowly turns and slides back into the dark, familiar safety of the anoxic water. It is still an amphibian, bound to the swamp to keep its skin moist and to lay its soft, jelly-like eggs. It has not conquered the land, it has merely raided it. But as the water ripples and settles, the muddy bank tells a different story. Pressed deeply into the red Devonian earth, clear and unmistakable, is the impression of heavy, splayed toes. It is the signature of a new era. The first footprint has been left upon the earth, and the trajectory of life will never be the same. Despite the towering majesty of the Archaeopteris canopy and the complex, scuttling food webs established in the leaf litter below, the Devonian forests harbor a fatal geographical weakness. If an observer were to fly above the coastlines and head deep into the interior of the supercontinent Gondwana, the green would abruptly stop. The deep inland regions remain exactly as they were at the beginning of the period. Vast, howling deserts of naked red rock and oxidized dust. The forests are trapped. They form a magnificent, vibrant ring around the margins of the continents, but they cannot penetrate the dry interior. The invisible chain that binds the towering forests to the water is not structural. It is reproductive. Archaeopteris and the other early trees reproduce through the shedding of spores. While spores are incredibly light and can be carried by the wind for hundreds of miles, they possess a critical biological flaw. When a spore lands, it grows into a tiny, fragile intermediate stage that produces sperm and eggs. In order for the sperm to reach the egg, it must literally swim. If the soil is completely dry, the sperm cannot survive, and reproduction fails entirely. No matter how tall the wooden trunk or how deep the roots, the Devonian plants remain reproductively aquatic. To break this final chain and conquer the hostile, arid interior of the continents, biology must engineer an escape pod. It requires a mechanism that severs the requirement for external water. The evolutionary answer to this problem is the invention of the seed. To understand the significance of the seed, one must view it not merely as a hard shell, but as a microscopic biological spacecraft. The seed is designed to take the delicate, aquatic environment necessary for fertilization and package it entirely within a watertight hull. It carries a fully fertilized embryo, shielding it from the severe dry air of the outside world. But the true genius of the seed lies in its payload. A spore is nothing more than naked genetic instructions. It must immediately find moisture and nutrients, or it will perish. A seed, however, is packed with a dense layer of high-calorie tissue known as the endosperm. This is a built-in life support system. It provides the embryo with the exact energy it needs to drive its first root deep into the soil and push its first leaf toward the sun. Furthermore, the thick, protective seed coat grants the plant a power that spores lack entirely: the ability to wait. A seed can lie dormant in the baking red dust for years, effectively stopping biological time until the heavy Devonian rains finally arrive. The pioneers of this reproductive revolution are a group of plants known as the pteridosperms, or seed ferns. A prime example is Elkinsia, a plant that flourishes in the late Devonian. To look at Elkinsia is to see a plant that closely resembles the ferns of the modern forest floor. It possesses the same delicate, deeply lobed green fronds, but during its reproductive cycle, it does not release the familiar pale yellow mist of billions of microscopic spores. Instead, at the very tips of its specialized fronds, it develops complex, cup-like structures. Nestled securely within these protective cups are the Ichthyostega first true seeds. The introduction of the heavy seed fundamentally alters the sensory experience of the forest. The reproductive season is no longer a silent, drifting fog of yellow dust catching in the humid air. The acoustic landscape of the Devonian gains a new, distinct rhythm. It is the sound of gravity acting upon biology. There is a sudden snap as a seed detaches from a high frond, followed by a sharp, audible thud as it strikes the damp earth or the rotting wood of the forest floor. It is a subtle noise, but it echoes with profound evolutionary consequence. Each thud represents a fully contained, independent packet of life successfully navigating the air. Armed with this heavily armored, self-sustaining technology, the plants finally break out of the coastal swamps. They begin a relentless, generational march into the deep, arid interior of the continents. Seeds are carried by the heavy storm winds or washed by sudden flash floods deep into the dry, rocky valleys of the old red sandstone. Because they carry their own water and their own food, they can germinate in environments where a spore would instantly desiccate. The stark, brutal dividing line between the green coastal margins and the dead red desert begins to slowly blur and fade. As the seed ferns climb higher into the foothills of the Acadian mountains and push deeper into the arid plains, they physically transform the visual identity of the planet. The overall albedo of the Eartha Euro, the amount of sunlight reflected back into space Euro, begins to shift. The dark, light-absorbing green of the expanding forests replaces the highly reflective red rock over millions of square miles. This massive change in surface color absorbs more solar energy, subtly altering regional weather patterns and drawing more moisture inland, which in turn allows the forests to push even further into the desert. Simultaneously, the invention of the seed accidentally creates a massive, new energetic economy within the terrestrial food web. For the arthropods scuttling through the leaf litter, a spore offers almost no nutritional value, but a seed, packed with high-density fats, starches, and proteins intended for the plant embryo, is an absolute treasure. It is the most concentrated packet of calories ever to exist on the land. The millipedes and early insects quickly discover this new resource. The plants have inadvertently minted the most valuable currency in the forest, sparking a complex, co-evolutionary dance between the organisms that produce the seeds and the creatures that seek to consume them. The development of the seed is the ultimate declaration of independence from the Panthalassic Ocean. The plants have fully, irreversibly committed to the dry earth. They have solved the problems of gravity with wood, the problem of extraction with roots, and finally, the problem of reproduction with the seed. The continents are no longer just a hostile frontier to be raided. They are a permanent home. The plants have paved the way, creating the physical structure, the breathable oxygen, and the dense nutritional packets required for the vertebrate Euro, currently dragging themselves through the coastal Muda Euro to eventually follow them inland. The greening of the earth is complete. The conquest of the continents by the vast, seed-bearing forests is a triumph of biological engineering. From the coastal swamps to the deep interior of Gondwana, the naked red rock has been smothered under a blanket of deep green. But this unprecedented success sets into motion a profound sequence of planetary events. There is a deeply ingrained assumption that nature inherently seeks a state of peaceful equilibrium. The late Devonian period proves this to be a profound illusion. When a new biological innovation operates without constraint, it will consume its environment until the global system completely breaks. The plants are the architects of their own decline. The mechanism of this destruction is written in the very structure of the trees. The massive trunks of Archaeopteris and the newly evolved seed ferns are built primarily of carbon, extracted directly from the thick carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere. For millions of years, the forests act as a planetary-scale vacuum, inhaling the greenhouse gas at a staggering rate. Because the fungi and bacteria of the era are still struggling to efficiently digest the rigid lignin that makes up the wood, the fallen trees do not rot back into the atmosphere. They are buried in the deep, anoxic swamps. Millions of tons of solid carbon are systematically removed from the sky and locked deep within the crust of the earth. This relentless carbon sequestration fundamentally destabilizes the climate. The heavy, insulating greenhouse blanket that has defined the Devonian since its inception a Euro, the thick atmosphere that trapped the thermal radiation of the sun and kept the global ocean boiling with life a euro, begins to thin and fracture. Without the high concentrations of carbon dioxide to reflect the heat back down to the surface, the solar energy simply bounces off the planet and escapes into the cold vacuum of space. The profound, uninterrupted warmth of the early epochs begins a slow, steady descent. The Earth is being refrigerated by its own forests. The physical reality of this cooling is first felt at the absolute southern extreme of the planet. The deep interior of the supercontinent, Gondwana, sits directly over the South Pole. For tens of millions of years, this region was a baking, arid desert of cracked rock, swept by hot, dry winds. But as the global temperature plummets, the heavy, humid rain that occasionally swept across the polar latitudes begins to change. The ambient temperature drops below freezing. The precipitation falls not as warm, heavy drops of liquid water, but as silent, white, crystalline flakes. It is the first snow the Devonian Earth has experienced in eons. The silence of the red desert is replaced by the soft, endless whisper of falling snow. Because the summer temperatures are no longer high enough to melt the winter precipitation, the snow does not disappear. It accumulates. Year after year, century after century, the white blanket grows thicker. The sheer weight of the accumulating snow begins to compress the lower layers, squeezing out the air and transforming the fragile flakes into solid, dense, brilliant blue ice. A permanent polar ice cap is born, an immense, frozen shield expanding outward from the heart of Gondwana. This ice is not static. It is a dynamic, formidable geological force. As the ice cap grows miles thick, gravity forces it to move. The edges of the glacier begin a slow, unstoppable march northward across the continent. It acts as a planetary bulldozer, thousands of feet of solid ice grinding across the bedrock. The early seed ferns that had bravely marched into the southern latitudes are swept away, crushed and scraped away by the advancing wall of frost. The ice reclaims the land, replacing the vibrant green of the new forests with a stark, blinding white desolation. The growth of the Gondwanan ice cap triggers an immediate and profound consequence for the rest of the planet. The ice acts as a massive, frozen sponge, drawing moisture out of the atmosphere and locking it onto the land. Every million tons of snow that falls and freezes at the pole is a million tons of water physically removed from the Panthalassic Ocean. As the glaciers expand their footprint across the southern hemisphere, the global sea level begins to drop with astonishing speed. The vast, shallow continental seesaw Euro, the warm, sunlit nurseries that drove the explosion of marine evolution and sheltered the first jawed fish Euro, begin to systematically drain away. The ocean is physically retreating from the land, leaving behind miles of exposed, muddy flats that quickly freeze in the newly chilled air. The first victims of this retreating ocean are the magnificent Stromatoporoid reefs. For millions of years, these towering biological fortresses were meticulously constructed in water just tens of meters deep. They relied entirely on the warm, shallow currents to deliver sunlight and dissolved minerals. But as the sea level plummets, the water simply drops out from beneath them. The towering domes of sponge and the delicate, branching terraces of coral are suddenly thrust through the surface of the water and exposed directly to the harsh, freezing air. The decline of the reefs is absolute. The soft, living tissues of the corals and sponges immediately desiccate and freeze in the newly chilled atmosphere. The vibrant, chaotic metropolis of the Devonian shallows, once echoing with the rush of currents and the crunch of armored predators, goes completely silent. The massive limestone structures bleach bone white beneath the hazy sun, transforming from thriving ecosystems into vast, towering remnants of calcium carbonate. The architecture of the shallow sea has been ruined. The steady retreat of the water forces the surviving marine life into a highly competitive bottleneck. The formidable Placoderms, with their massive bone shears, and the muscular lobe-finned fish, once the undisputed masters of the shallow reefs and the flooded coastal swamps, find their complex habitats shrinking rapidly. The labyrinth of hiding places and ambush points is gone. they are forced to fall back into the deeper, darker, and significantly colder waters of the open ocean, environments for which their heavy armor and ambush tactics are poorly adapted. The golden age of the Devonian Ocean, defined by its endless warmth, vibrant reefs, and shallow abundance, is quietly ending. The cold has arrived, and it brings with it the creeping shadow of a planetary mass transition. The profound cooling of the planet and the immense expansion of the Gondwana ice cap represent only the first deep resonance of the late Devonian extinction. While the glaciers are crushing the southern forests and draining the shallow seas, a second, far more subtle mechanism of change is operating completely out of sight. It is not driven by temperature or ice. It is driven by the very architecture that allowed the plants to conquer the continents in the first place. The final shift to the marine ecosystem is delivered by the roots of the trees. To understand this subterranean disaster, one must look closely at the mechanical interaction between the forest and the earth. The massive root systems of Archaeopteris and the early seed ferns are not passive structures. They are aggressive biological drills. They force their way into the microscopic fissures of the old red sandstone, exerting immense hydraulic pressure that physically shatters the solid bedrock. Simultaneously, the roots and their symbiotic mycorrhizal fungi secrete highly corrosive organic acids. These acids chemically digest the stone, dissolving the mineral bonds that have held the continent together for eons. The primary target of this biological mining operation is phosphorus, an element absolutely essential for cellular growth and reproduction. For billions of years, the vast majority of the Eartha-Euros phosphorus was locked securely away in the unyielding rock. But the Devonian forests break the vault. As millions of square miles of bedrock are pulverized and dissolved by the advancing root networks, unimaginable quantities of phosphorus are suddenly liberated into the soil. The heavy, relentless rains of the Devonian wash this massive chemical payload out of the fresh dirt, down the rivers, and directly into the shrinking Panthalassic Ocean. This sudden influx of phosphorus reveals a profound and counterintuitive insight into the mechanics of planetary transition. In the modern imagination, a mass extinction is almost always associated with a sudden, devastating lack of resources. An asteroid impact blocking the sun and starving the food chain, or a sudden desertification eliminating water. The late Devonian extinction operates on the exact opposite principle. It is an immense transition triggered by a profound excess of nutrients. The marine ecosystem is not starved to death. It is overwhelmed by abundance. The Devonian Ocean is overwhelmed by the overabundance of its own food. The immediate biological response to this massive chemical dumping occurs in the sunlit surface waters of the ocean. Microscopic phytoplankton, suddenly provided with an unlimited supply of phosphorus and nitrogen, experience an explosive, uncontrollable population boom. This is a planetary-scale algal bloom. The clear, light-penetrating blue of the open ocean is rapidly replaced by a thick, opaque sludge. The water turns deeply imbalanced, choked with swirling, dense mats of green and rust-red algae that stretch for thousands of miles across the surface. This thick, floating biological film immediately alters the physics of the ocean. The continent-sized algal bloom acts as a massive, impenetrable sunshade, completely blocking the vital solar radiation from penetrating into the deeper water column. The remaining photosynthetic organisms that had managed to survive the draining of the shallow Reefs, the deep water algae, the delicate symbiotic organisms, and the specialized cyanobacteria are suddenly plunged into total artificial darkness. Without sunlight to drive photosynthesis, they cannot produce oxygen. The primary respiratory engine of the global ocean, which had functioned flawlessly for hundreds of millions of years, abruptly begins to stall and fail. But the true scale of the algal bloom begins when the microscopic plants start to perish. The lifespan of a single phytoplankton is measured in days. As the massive continent-sized blooms mature and perish, they create a continuous, heavy rain of dead organic matter. Billions of tons of sinking microscopic matter begin to sink slowly from the surface, down into the dark, chilling depths of the ocean. The water column is filled with a falling blizzard of biological decay. Waiting in the dark depths are the decomposing bacteria, presented with this endless, unprecedented buffet of falling organic matter. Their populations explode exponentially. They multiply by the trillions, feasting on the settling remnants of the surface bloom. But the biochemical process of decomposition carries a heavy, severe cost. It requires oxygen. In their rapid consumption of the dead algae, the bacteria strip the surrounding water of every available molecule of dissolved oxygen. The deep ocean, already struggling from the stalled photosynthesis above and the overall cooling of the planet, is rapidly and completely depleted of its breathable air. The technical term for this condition is ocean anoxia. The water becomes a vast, black, dead zone. In the complete absence of oxygen, a new class of anaerobic bacteria takes over the decomposition process. These specialized microbes do not produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct. They produce hydrogen sulfide. This is a highly toxic, corrosive gas that carries a harsh chemical scent. The deep ocean is fundamentally transformed into a massive, anoxic expanse. And as the rain of dead algae continues to fall, this black, anoxic zone begins to slowly rise from the depths, creeping upward toward the surface. The complex marine life of the Devonian is suddenly caught in a severe, inescapable constraint. The architectural complexity of the ocean is gone. If the fish attempt to remain in the familiar shallow continental margins, they face the freezing air, the expanding ice sheets, and the rapidly disappearing water caused by the advancing glaciations of Gondwana. If they attempt to flee the freezing shallows and dive into the open ocean to escape the cold, they swim directly into the rising, invisible tide of toxic, anoxic black water. The global ocean, once an endless sanctuary, has become a planetary boundary. There is nowhere left to hide. For the apex predators of the era, the Placoderms, this environmental trap is a severe challenge. Their massive, dense bone armor and highly active hunting strategies require a tremendous amount of oxygen to maintain. As the oxygen levels in the water plummet to near zero, the heavily armored giants are the first to deplete. They cannot breathe the toxic hydrogen sulfide, the iconic snap of the placoderm jaw, the sound that defined the aggressive explosion of Devonian life, is silenced. They sink into the black sludge of the deep ocean, joining the very mass transition event that the roots of the trees had blindly engineered. The Devonian period does not end with the sudden, blinding flash of an asteroid impact. It ends with a slow depletion, stretching over millions of years in a series of environmental pulses known as the Kellwasser and Hangenberg events. When the planetary climate finally stabilizes and the anoxic black waters begin to slowly recede, the Earth that emerges is profoundly scarred. To look beneath the surface of the surviving ocean is to witness a silent stillness. The vibrant, chaotic energy of the early epochs has been entirely faded. The sheer scale of the biological loss is staggering. Paleontologists estimate that roughly 75% of all marine species are wiped from the planet. The most glaring absence is the architecture of the shallow seas. The magnificent continent spanning reefs, meticulously built over millions of years by the brainless engineering of the Stromatoporoid sponges and the tabulate corals, are dead. The massive limestone fortresses stand empty, bleaching in the cold water. They will slowly crumble into rubble. The Stromatoporoids are functionally extinct, and the Earth will never again see reefs constructed by these massive, heavy sponges. Equally absolute is the destruction of the apex predators. The placoderms, the formidable, heavily armored kings of the Devonian Sea, are completely erased from the fossil record. Their massive, mechanical shearing jaws, which had ignited an evolutionary arms race and forced the entire ocean to adapt, were useless against the invisible threat of anoxia and the freezing temperatures. Their high metabolic demands, required to haul their heavy bone armor through the water, became a fatal liability when oxygen levels plummeted. They fade away entirely, leaving no descendants in the modern world. The ancient, heavily armored jawless fish suffer a similar fate, reduced to a handful of fragile, deep-water lineages. Yet, as one looks away from the remnants of the ocean and turns toward the land, a strange and deeply counterintuitive reality becomes apparent. The late Devonian extinction is heavily, almost exclusively, biased against marine life. While the oceans are choked and frozen, the newly terraformed continents are surprisingly resilient. The terrestrial ecosystem is undoubtedly damaged by the severe climatic swings, but it does not collapse. The life that had so recently struggled to pull itself onto the mud finds itself uniquely equipped to survive the immense transition. The towering forests survive because of the incredible technology of the seed. As the Gondwana glaciers advance and the global temperature plummets, creating long, brutal winters, the plants do not die. They retreat. The seeds, with their heavy, watertight coats and dense internal food supplies, act as biological time capsules. They lie dormant in the freezing mud, sleeping through the harshest conditions, and rapidly germinating during the brief, cool summers. The deep, rock-crushing roots hold the soil in place against the violent storms. The forest is pushed back, but its genetic continuity is never broken. Beneath the surviving trees, the arthropod empire actually finds a strange sanctuary in the disaster. The massive, sudden decline of vegetation caused by the freezing temperatures creates an unprecedented accumulation of dead, rotting wood and leaf litter on the forest floor. For the detritivore Sauro, the millipedes and early springtail Sauro, this is an endless, insulated bounty of food. Shielded from the bitter wind by the physical structure of the fallen logs and protected from desiccation by their chitinous armor, the insects and arachnids comfortably ride out the mass transition event in the dark, damp shadows. But the most critical survivors of the Devonian immense transition are the tetrapods. The early amphibians, creatures like Ichthyostega, represent the fragile, physical link between the dead ocean and the living land. They are still fundamentally tied to the water for reproduction, and the toxic freezing conditions of the swamps push them to the absolute brink of extinction. Many early lineages are completely wiped out, but a crucial few, the ancestors of every reptile, bird, mammal, and human that will ever live, manage to endure. Their survival reveals a beautiful, paradoxical insight into the nature of evolution. The defining physical traits of the tetrapoda euro, the muscular lung and the bony, articulated limba euro, were never designed to survive a global mass transition. As established earlier, they were desperate, localized adaptations engineered solely to deal with the rotting, wood-choked anoxic swamps of the Archaeopteris forests. Walking on land was merely an accidental byproduct of trying to navigate a submerged obstacle course. Yet, when the global ocean system completely failed, these highly specific accidental adaptations suddenly became the ultimate planetary life rafts. If the ancestors of the tetrapods had remained pure fish, relying entirely on gills to extract dissolved oxygen from the water, they would have shared the fate of the Placoderms. They would have overwhelmed as the rising tide of hydrogen sulfide and black anoxic water consumed the shallows. But because they possessed a lung, initially designed just to gulp air when the swamp got too stagnant, they could completely bypass the poisoned water column. As the ocean faded entirely beneath them, the tetrapods simply lifted their heavy heads above the surface and breathed the cold, clean atmosphere directly. Furthermore, when the coastal waters froze solid or became too toxic to endure, the standard fish was trapped. It could only swim deeper into the dark, severe anoxic zones. The tetrapod possessed the ultimate escape mechanism. Utilizing the muscular, lever-like limbs that had evolved to drag their bodies over submerged roots, they could physically haul themselves completely out of the inhospitable zone. They dragged their heavy bellies through the freezing mud, leaving the poisoned ocean behind, and found sanctuary in the damp, decaying, and calorie-rich undergrowth of the surviving forests. If an observer were to stand on a freezing, rocky shoreline at the very end of the Devonian period, the scene would encapsulate a profound shift in the balance of planetary power. Resting on the muddy bank is a solitary, heavily scaled amphibian. Its flanks heave as it pulls the heavy air into its primitive lungs. Behind it lies the ocean, an immense, black, and silent graveyard that for hundreds of millions of years was the undisputed center of life on Earth. But the amphibian does not look back at the water. Its flat skull is pointed toward the dark tree line of the continent. The marine monopoly has been permanently broken. The future belongs to the land. The Devonian period draws to its final, quiet close, leaving behind a planet that is fundamentally unrecognizable from the one that began it. 60 million years of extreme, relentless evolutionary pressure have completely rewritten the physical and biological rules of the Earth. What started as a world defined by boiling greenhouse oceans and stark, barren continents of oxidized red rock has been transformed. The oceans have been scoured by cold and mass extinction, their towering reefs reduced to silent ruins. But the continents, once the most hostile environments in the solar system, are now draped in the deep, heavy green of the first true forests, humming with the mechanical clicking of terrestrial life. To look back across the vast expanse of the Devonian is to witness the absolute crucible of modern biology. It is the era that forged the architectural foundation of the vertebrate body. The dissolved calcium of the shallow seas was harvested to build the first complex skeletons. The simple, muscular tubes used to pump water over the gills were radically repurposed into the first hinged jaws, creating the concept of the active predator. The intense, stagnant environments of the rotting swamps forced the invention of the lung, allowing the first deep breaths of atmospheric air. And the chaotic, tangled obstacle course of the submerged roots sculpted the first fingers and toes. Every human being carries the physical legacy of the Devonian in their very bones. Yet, the most profound lesson of this ancient era is the realization that evolution is entirely blind. There is no grand, premeditated design leading toward the present. The Devonian is a masterclass in the beauty of unintended consequences. The limb was not designed to conquer the land. It was a desperate tool to survive the choked water. The lung was not an ambition to breathe the sky. It was a life raft to escape Anoxia. And the magnificent, continent-spanning forests did not intend to refrigerate the Earth and trigger a mass extinction. They were simply trying to capture the sun. Life survives not through perfect planning, but through brilliant, accidental repurposing. As the period ends, the planet enters a profound state of geological and biological exhaustion. The fossil record from this immediate aftermath goes almost entirely silent, a period known to paleontologists as Roemer's Gap. It is a deep, planetary pause. The frenetic, high-stakes arms races of the coral reefs have been extinguished. The urgent, scrambling invasions of the muddy coastlines have ceased. The surviving life forms the scattered tetrapods, the burrowing arthropods, and the dormant seeds of the great trees hunker down to weather the lingering cold. The Earth is healing, resetting its chemistry, and preparing for the massive coal swamps of the Carboniferous period that lie ahead. But for now, the world is characterized only by an immense, overriding stillness. The pace of time seems to slow. Over the surviving coastal forests of Laurussia, the hazy, heavy Devonian sun begins its descent. The thick, humid atmosphere catches the fading light, turning the sky into a deep, bruised canvas of violet and dark indigo. The towering, fern-like silhouettes of the Archaeopteris trees cast long, heavy shadows across the damp, muddy floodplains. The heat of the day dissipates slowly, radiating out from the bare rocks and the dark water, leaving behind a cool, comfortable twilight. The violent, aggressive acoustic landscape of the Devonian fades into silence. The striking, percussive snap of the armored placoderm jaws has been erased forever. The howling, tearing winds of the massive hypercanes have subsided. What remains is a soft, rhythmic symphony of rest. It is the gentle, continuous rustle of billions of delicate fern fronds shifting in the cool evening breeze. It is the slow, rhythmic lap of the dark water against the muddy banks, a quiet echo of the massive tides that once scoured the bare rock. Beneath the canopy, the micro-world of the forest floor begins to power down. The dropping temperature signals an end to the day's frantic consumption. Deep within the insulated, rotting architecture of the fallen logs, the giant millipedes stop their chewing. They curl their heavily armored, multi-segmented bodies into tight, protective spirals, sinking into a state of deep, metabolic rest. The fast, venomous centipedes retreat into the dark, damp crevices of the bedrock, their hunting finished for the night. The complex, predatory tension of the leaf litter dissolves into a safe, absolute stillness. At the edge of the water, a surviving tetrapod finds sanctuary. It drags its heavy, muscular body out of the dark, shallow pool and settles onto a bed of damp moss and decaying fronds. It does not need to swim anymore. It does not need to fight the heavy, toxic anoxia of the deep. It rests its heavy, flattened skull upon its newly evolved, articulated wrists. The specialized eyes, designed to scan the surface for danger, slowly close. Its flanks rise and fall in a slow, steady, hypnotic rhythm, drawing the cool, oxygen-rich air deep into its primitive lungs. It is secure. It is anchored to the solid earth. As the darkness deepens, the massive Devonian moon rises above the horizon. Because it orbits so much closer to the earth, it dominates the night sky, casting a pale, silver illumination over the silent continent. The moonlight filters through the high canopy, painting the damp forest floor in shifting patterns of silver and deep black. The gravitational pull of the moon continues its slow, invisible work, pulling the tides across the ruined ocean. But the urgency is gone. It is merely the comforting, mechanical rhythm of a solar system turning in the dark, a planetary metronome marking the slow passage of deep time. Hundreds of millions of years separate this ancient night from the present moment. The continents will drift, the oceans will rise and fall, and countless species will emerge and vanish into the stone. But the fundamental biological necessity for rest remains entirely unbroken. The struggles of the day, whether they involve escaping a Devonian swamp or navigating the complexities of the modern world, are over. The evolutionary tension can be released. The mind, like the ancient forest, can finally power down. The perspective slowly pulls back, drifting up from the sleeping amphibian, rising silently through the layers of the dark, protective canopy, and ascending into the vast, star-filled sky. The earth below is a sphere of deep blue and dark green, suspended in the silent vacuum of space. The violent birth of the vertebrate world has concluded. The Devonian period is over. The planet is at peace. There is nothing left to do but surrender to the stillness. Let the rhythm of the breathing slow to match the ocean tide and drift into a deep, uninterrupted sleep.